Okay, welcome back, everyone. If you're rejoining us, we're going to move into the next presentation. There's a group of students from the US, mentored by Amelia Fitch and Matt Ayers from Dartmouth, who've been working on understanding soils and life beneath our feet. So I'd like to turn it over to the soils team to get going with their presentation.
Hi everyone, and welcome to our presentation about soils, which we have titled Sedimental Connections, as a little play on words there on sentimental, because we all have soil and we're all connected by earth and plant life materials. So we dug deeper and understood and compared the particulates that bear life, and the students in this group were Katie, Alicia, Chloe, Roman, Celia, Anna, Samuel, and Quinn, and then our lovely mentors were Amelia and Matt. Next slide, please.
So before we dig into our project, we wanted to share a quote that we think really captures the importance that soil has both indirectly and directly on all our lives. Essentially, all life depends upon soil. There can be no life without soil and no soil without life. Next slide, please. Just a little about our project. So human impacted and natural soil from across different regions in the US was examined and analyzed. So in each of these unique regions, we examined and analyzed two soil sites, I guess. One from a human impacted area. So that would be an area like a lawn at your home or just anywhere where humans have altered the environment. And the natural area would be somewhere like a forest or any area with relatively low human disturbance. Next slide, please.
So this is an acronym for the most impactful drivers that determine soil differences between our areas. And this was our basis for experimentation and a major part of our research. So the CL stands for climate, the O stands for organism, the R for relief, the P for parent material, and the T for time. Next slide.
One factor that we realized affects soil but isn't part of the CLORPT acronym is human impact. Not all of the world's soil is undisturbed in a peaceful forest or desert. Much of it is in lawns, under buildings, or routinely receives a dose of fertilizer or pesticide. As a research group, we are really interested in what effects humans have on soil and why this is significant for the environment. Next slide. Much of our daily life requires soil to be altered. The food we eat was grown on a farm or raised on grazing grounds. We obtain materials from mines or deforestation. Even our lawns and gardens are altered from their natural state. Each member of our group sampled soil from a natural environment and from a disturbed environment, which for us was usually our lawns or our gardens. We are interested in how the soils compare in their organic horizons, biodiversity, and root density. Would anyone from the audience like to share a prediction on what we found the differences between disturbed soil and undisturbed soil for any of these three factors?
Any audience members can feel free to unmute themselves and share.
Lower mycorrhizae in the disturbed soils.
Thank you. We'll see. Next slide, please.
So in order to compare the human impacted areas and the less impacted areas, one of our main methods of characterizing the differences between the soils was measuring the depth of the organic horizon. So the O horizon is the top layer of the soil, which usually contains organic matter like decomposing leaves. And so in each of our plots, we dug until we reached the mineral horizon, which often has a different color and composition when compared to the organic horizon. And then we measured the depth of each of our holes. So these box plots show the centimeters to the mineral horizon in the plots with more human impact, which you can see on the left, and the plots with less human impact, which is on the right. In 8 out of 10 of the sites that we sampled, the organic horizon was shallower at the plot with more human impact, and the average depth for the human impacted areas was 10.8 centimeters compared to 21.5 centimeters for the unimpacted areas. And there's also a smaller range across the sites for the human impacted plots. Next slide, please.
So what I measured was the changes in biodiversity in the areas of human impact and the areas without human impact. So this is the percent increase in the plants. So around the different parts of the country, you can see how in certain areas there's a 0% increase in the biodiversity of plants, and some there is 600% increase. But what we measured with the plants was the plants that were in a foot by foot square or meter by meter square, and the roots that could be going underneath of it was counted in the area. Next slide, please. Did I say next slide? I'm sorry, I can't remember if I said it or not. All right, so the next was the biodiversity of animals. So these animals were, we didn't want to limit ourselves to just insects because there were worms and other things like that. So what some of us did is we laid out pitfall traps. So that's a cup or a dish of water with a little bit of soap in it that's buried on the same level as the soil, so that any bugs will fall in and the soap will break the surface tension and then they'll fall in. So when I left mine overnight and I came back and I counted different numbers and different species of insects and other animals that had fallen in. So here are the percentages of those areas from the altered to the unaltered. Next slide, please. And then here is the increase in the biodiversity of the types of worms. And why worms are separate from the animal's total is worms are a huge factor for soil aeration. Worms form tunnels in the soil and they transport nutrients and they are very important for soil health. Next slide.
So what I did was go and research the various parent materials that make up our respective areas and finding out what they were originally made out of, or what the lower areas in the soil are made out of, as well as any glacial history, which also does affect the health of the soil. And along with affecting the biodiversity with the type of soil that it is, you can also see that there's a very large change between which side of the country you're on, and there's a lot of very large words here. So basically, where I'm just going to use the little one at the very bottom left, because that's the one I can explain the best, is my current area. Weakly consolidated alluvial sediment, so the ground is very hard packed, it is very rocky, it's very gritty, has a lot of loam and silt in it, and that just makes it very hard and rocky along with the arid climate. So areas that are glacially affected tend to be either more fertile or have a greater rate of biodiversity due to the effect that a glacier causes in a landscape. And then there's also a whole different type along with the coastal landscapes too. So yeah. Next slide.
We measured the root density of the soils by looking at the ratio between the volume of the roots that we dug up and the volume of total landmass removed. The higher the soil density, the more roots the higher the root density, the more roots there are in the soil. As you can see in the graph, the green bar represents the undisturbed soil and the yellow bar represents the human impacted soil. We found a much higher density of roots in the undisturbed soil than in the impacted soil. Since organic material is made out of carbon, having roots in the ground means that more carbon is sequestered in the ground and there is less in the atmosphere causing climate change. Also, roots often pair with mycorrhizal fungi, so more roots in the ground allows for decomposition in nature's recycling. When humans impact soil, they subtract from these essential natural processes. Next slide, please. Taking a look at all of our findings associated with human impact, it is clear that keeping soils undisturbed is important. But take a look at the graph. Our population is growing at a very high rate, and each person has a carbon footprint. As more and more of our land is being disturbed, it is critical for us to learn about the consequences that that may have. Next slide.
Hello, so this is Quinn, and I worked partly on analyzing how do climate factors affect soil. So next slide. And this is the data that I compiled from all of our documents, and the MAP stands for meters of annual precipitation, while MAT stands for meters of annual temperature. And we took these data from NOAA, which is a US database, and we compared it to the depth to mineral soil at our undisturbed and disturbed sites. So the red points represents less human impact, and blue represents more human impact. And for looking at the precipitations in relation to depth to mineral on the left, we could see that there's a positive correlation. And while on the right with temperature, there's not as strong of a correlation. And this might be, so this shows us that precipitation plays a critical role in how depth to mineral is affected. And why this is important is that, and how it relates to JSEP and climate change, is that as our precipitation and temperature can change as the temperature fluctuates due to climate change, and that could impact the depth to mineral soil, which is really critical to the way plants prosper. And next, please.
One of the major climate factors we thought may have an impact on soil biodiversity was precipitation. So we collected data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration on the mean average precipitation in centimeters of our different locations, and we graphed it with the biodiversity of our areas to see if there was a correlation. And so we quantified the biodiversity by counting the number of species in our soil samples that we collected. So based on our data, there seemed to be no correlation, but this might not reflect the relationship between biodiversity and precipitation in reality. So for more accurate conclusions, we would probably need a larger data set. And I also think it's pretty interesting that we got different results on a similar topic compared to the fish team.
So as a continuation of the climate and how it affects the soil, I made some graphs about the climate and how it affects the root density. Really sorry about the quality of them. They're a picture on my phone of a computer screen due to some technical difficulties. So you can kind of see there is not a very good correlation here. Oh yeah, and the blue is the more human impact, and the red is the less human impact. Between the mean annual precipitation and total root density. I think I've. Oh no. Wait a minute. Oh, okay. I am talking about this. Okay. Yeah, so some things that I found that might appear on a layer is that perhaps as there is more, you can see there's like kind of like a slight decrease. I'm not sure if that's an actual thing or if that's just something that we found. It might not be a connection, it's just a maybe correlation. Is that maybe as there's more rain, the roots might be smaller because they don't need to be as big to soak up the rain, which is something I guessed, but it could also be we have limited data and I don't know. But the American Geophysical Union also said that for water-limited ecosystems, increases in wetness of the climate produced deeper roots, and the root depth is sensitive to changes in the depth of rain events than to their frequency. So yeah, next slide. This is a climate and root density, which is measured in temperature Celsius. I noticed that, yeah, not the best the data isn't really solid, but it looks like there's a little more of a trend here, as the temperature goes up, there's more root density. Yeah. Another thing to consider in this that we didn't consider is that we took different amounts of soil samples and like separated the roots from them, and then like did like a rate of like, did like a percentage and found the percent of root. And we didn't consider, like, some people took a lot more soil than others, like what it was coming from, like the organic horizon. Maybe some of it people got like from also the mineral horizon, because some people dug deeper. And we also had, like Sam was saying earlier, a lot of different types of soil, which are also factors. Yeah. Next slide. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Anna, and I focus more on the polar science discipline of climate and soil, and so this is another subtopic that we went on in this module. Next slide, please. So in our data spreadsheet, we all also researched independently our glacial history and if there was any. So basically asking, was there once ice that covered our plains? And so here are the 4 states that have the most prominent glacial history, and we just kind of detailed when the last movement was. So that's what all of the numbers means, like 12,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago was the last prominent movement of glaciers and ice. And so this carved out a lot of our regions and deposited some sediments and residue remains and accumulations of silt. And so once we started to compare this, we can now look in the future why all of our regions have different soils and what this means for our climate change today. Next slide, please. Awesome. So now that we've looked at the history of our past of these 4 states, I was able to take out the 4 most common remains and residues that were left behind. And so these were moraine, glacial till, glacial outwash, and eskers. And what these 4 are moraine is glacially formed accumulation of unconsolidated glacial debris that occurs in both currently and formerly glaciated regions on Earth through geomorphological processes. And this basically means like a ton of sediments are all compacted on our coasts, or if your state has more hills or regions, then there's a good chance that it was carved out by glaciers that were moving a couple thousand years ago. Glacial till is a sub-region of moraine, which is like the small little peat and clay-sized fragments and boulders, and it's just a jumble of rocks and sediments that was mixed into the ice. Which is more of a heterogeneous mixture compared to glacial outwash, which is more of a homogeneous mixture, and that's sediments and stones that was freed by melting ice and the sands and silts. And then last, we have another formation called eskers, which are also deposited along the course of ice rivers that were moving as they were melted. So this is why when you're asking why are all of the regions of the US so different, you can take a look at their glacial history, and as soon as you start taking a deeper look into that, you can realize why there are all these different depositions and accumulations is because of what glaciers moved or didn't move and deposited these big rocks. Next slide, please. So now that we know our glacial history, you can sort of tie this into what the other students were talking about with soil quality. And now that we understand our impact in the history, we can break down why we need to maintain our soil quality. And I know that we're running low on time, so I'll try and be as succinct as possible. While weather is a short-term part of climate, certain weather cycles can still affect soil. For example, soil can be dried out and rearranged during droughty or windy weather. As the soil is dried out, plant growth is reduced, which reduces the stability of the surface layer and allows more erosion. An extreme example of this is called desertification, and that's when soils are losing their moisture and become more silty and sandy, and this is what leads to things like the Dust Bowl, which was during the Great Depression. So to avoid these phenomena, that's why we started looking up how to retain our soil quality, and the top ways that we found that we can do this are reducing the number of animals grazing, moving animals to newer areas more frequently, using conservation tillage and no-till practices, using low intensity and high diversity crop rotations, maintaining perennial vegetation, using irrigation properly to increase ground cover, and using selective or staggered tree harvest techniques rather than clear cutting. So overall, soil is a crucial part of the carbon cycle, and it changes in soil management practices can reduce emissions of carbon containing gases from soil, which reduces climate change and reverses global warming. Thank you. Next slide, please. And these are just some pictures of us going out and researching. So that's pretty much it. Thank you so much. Next.
Great, thank you so much, soil team. If we can do an unmute and give a round of applause.
Ooh,
Yay.
go soil team.